Rizwan Malik wasn't just a criminal, he was a man who turned crime into a lifelong profession, building an empire so calculated and disciplined that even law enforcement struggled to keep up. From street markets to international smuggling, from forgery to financial fraud, his name became a shadowy legend, whispered in fear and admiration. But every empire has cracks, and Rizwan's story proves that even the most untouchable figure can vanish in the most unexpected way. In the early 1990s, the city was buzzing with stories of a man who seemed to live two lives. On the surface, Rizwan Malik appeared to be a rising entrepreneur, always dressed in sharp suits, driving expensive cars, and moving confidently among business circles. He had the kind of charm that made people trust him, and he knew how to use it. Beneath this polished image, however, was a very different reality. Rizwan was no ordinary man chasing success in the traditional sense. He was a criminal who had chosen crime not as a desperate act but as a full-time profession, carefully built over years of study, observation, and ruthless ambition. From the beginning, his mindset was different from common thieves. He did not take risks without planning, and he never relied on luck. Every decision was calculated like moves on a chessboard, with Rizwan always thinking several steps ahead. His journey began in the crowded markets where thousands rushed through narrow lanes every day. As a teenager, Rizwan started by picking pockets and lifting valuables from distracted shoppers. Most youngsters in his position would have been caught or beaten by shopkeepers, but Rizwan had a talent for disappearing into crowds before anyone noticed. What set him apart was not just his skill with his hands, but his patience in watching, learning, and understanding patterns. He noticed how police patrols moved, how guards rotated shifts, and how merchants stored their cash. By the time he was in his late teens, Rizwan had already moved past petty theft. He saw no value in one-time risks when he could design a system that paid off repeatedly. His next step was forgery. With a small group of like-minded youths, he began producing counterfeit documents. Fake IDs, forged land papers, and false licenses passed through his hands with shocking authenticity. Officials who came across them often failed to tell the difference between real and fake. With every success, Rizwan grew bolder, not because he enjoyed the thrill, but because he believed he was building a career. He treated his crimes as investments, reinvesting his profits into new ventures, hiring more people, and expanding his reach. To him, a smuggling operation was no different from running a logistics company. By his mid-20s, Rizwan Malik had transformed from a street thief into a shadowy businessman. His name began to circulate quietly among police officers, whispered with both frustration and admiration. No one could prove his involvement, yet everyone knew he was there, pulling strings from the darkness, building an empire where crime was not a risk, it was a profession. Rizwan Malik's rise in the criminal world was marked by an unusual level of organization and discipline. While most criminals operated on impulse, relying on chance and instinct, Rizwan approached every move as if it were part of a structured business plan. He developed strict rules for his associates and expected loyalty to function like that of a corporate hierarchy. Meetings were scheduled, roles were clearly assigned, and punishments for mistakes were swift but calculated. To him, his network wasn't a gang, it was a company, with himself as the chief executive. His ability to separate personal feelings from his operations made him different from others in the underworld. He never allowed friendships, grudges, or emotions to interfere with his long-term vision. Every action was weighed against risk and profit, and nothing was left to chance. One of his biggest ventures during this period was smuggling. Rizwan built routes that stretched across borders, using bribed officials and hidden compartments in transport trucks to move stolen goods, rare items, and even weapons. The entire operation was run with the efficiency of an international shipping business. Deliveries were timed, records were kept in coded ledgers, and payments were processed through layers of middlemen to make tracing nearly impossible. He became so meticulous that even when authorities suspected his involvement, they could never find proof linking him directly to the crimes. On the outside, Rizwan appeared to be a wealthy trader, always investing in import-export companies, while in reality those companies were perfect covers for his smuggling empire. Counterfeiting became another cornerstone of his profession. The documents his team produced were flawless, often slipping past banks, offices, and even government departments without raising suspicion. These forgeries were not sold in the open, but quietly circulated through high-paying clients who needed fake passports, fraudulent property titles, or forged contracts to gain advantages. Each successful deal added to Rizwan's reputation, not just as a criminal but as someone who delivered results with professional precision. It was this consistency that made his empire grow stronger, as people in both the legal and illegal world sought his services. By the end of the decade, Rizwan Malik had become more than just a criminal mastermind. He was an institution in himself. Detectives who followed his trail often admitted grudging respect for his methods. He had blurred the line between crime and business so effectively that many began to question whether he was a criminal at all or simply a businessman who operated outside the law. His empire was thriving, and the man behind it remained untouchable, a ghost hiding in plain sight. As Rizwan Malik's empire expanded, so did the number of people surrounding him. Trusted lieutenants managed shipments, accountants handled the flow of money, and enforcers kept everyone in line. Yet with so many hands involved, it was only a matter of time before envy and ambition began to creep in. Among his closest circle was a man who had once been his most loyal associate, someone Rizwan had groomed from the early days. But loyalty in the underworld was fragile. This man, hungry for power and recognition, began passing bits of information to the police, believing he could weaken Rizwan's hold and eventually step into his position. The betrayal was carefully hidden, with small details fed to investigators to slowly paint a picture of Rizwan's operations. The effect was immediate. Police units raided warehouses, seized vehicles, and interrogated low-level workers. For the first time, Rizwan's network felt the heat closing in. Yet what the traitor failed to realize was that Rizwan had anticipated such a possibility long before. He always planned for betrayal, creating layers of protection so that no one associate could expose the full scope of his empire. When the raids occurred, warehouses were already empty, documents destroyed, and operations shifted to new locations. What police found were only shells of businesses and abandoned goods, never the mastermind himself. Every time they thought they were closing in, Rizwan slipped further away, leaving investigators frustrated and confused. Meanwhile, Rizwan quietly observed, piecing together the source of the leaks. He never confronted the traitor openly, never showed suspicion, and never lost his calm. Instead, he set up a careful trap. He began feeding false information through the suspected associate, knowing that the police would act on it. When the raids once again turned up nothing of value, suspicion began to fall on the very man who had been cooperating with them. Within months, the associate's credibility crumbled, and he disappeared under circumstances that were never explained. Some whispered that Rizwan arranged for his removal, while others believed the police themselves turned against him for wasting their time. The betrayal, rather than destroying Rizwan, only strengthened his empire. It sent a clear message to everyone in his circle. He was always watching, always calculating, and no one could outsmart him. Even in the shadows of betrayal, Rizwan managed to turn the situation to his advantage, leaving behind a trail of confusion and fear that only deepened his legend. With the betrayal behind him, Rizwan Malik shifted his focus toward a new horizon: financial crimes. He had already mastered smuggling and forgery, but the real money, he realized, was hidden within the walls of banks and corporations. Unlike the dangers of transporting goods across borders, financial crimes could be executed with the stroke of a pen or the click of a button. Rizwan reinvented his empire, creating layers of shell companies that appeared legitimate on paper but existed only to move money. He hired professionals, accountants, lawyers, and consultants who believed they were serving a successful businessman. Behind the polished image, however, Rizwan was orchestrating elaborate fraud schemes that drained millions. He specialized in manipulating systems. Using forged documents and false records, he secured massive loans from banks that were never repaid. Money was laundered through offshore accounts, converted into assets, and funneled back into his businesses. To anyone on the outside, Rizwan appeared as a genius investor, the kind of man who always knew where to put his money. In reality, every profit was stolen, and every loss was carefully hidden behind layers of deception. His operations became so vast that even auditors struggled to trace irregularities. Whenever suspicion arose, Rizwan produced just enough convincing paperwork to silence doubt. But with growth came exposure, and it wasn't long before law enforcement began to shift their focus. Detectives who had spent years chasing him in the shadows of smuggling now realized his empire had evolved into something far more dangerous. To penetrate his financial fortress, they introduced an undercover agent into his circle. Disguised as a corrupt accountant with a history of helping criminal organizations, the agent slowly earned Rizwan's trust. Over months of careful maneuvering, Rizwan began to rely on this newcomer, believing he had found another sharp mind to strengthen his empire. The agent, however, was gathering details that Rizwan had guarded for years. Every offshore account, every forged company, every fake contract was quietly documented. The cracks in Rizwan's empire, invisible to most, were now being exposed piece by piece. For the first time, the fortress he had built with such precision was no longer impenetrable. Rizwan still moved with confidence, unaware that the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced was not a rival criminal or a disloyal associate, but someone he himself had welcomed into his inner circle. The empire that once seemed unshakable was beginning to tremble, not from force, but from silence and patience. The fall of Rizwan Malik did not arrive with loud confrontations or dramatic arrests. Instead, it unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, as if he had scripted his own disappearance. By the time authorities were ready to strike with the evidence collected by the undercover agent, Rizwan was already gone. His offices were stripped bare, company records vanished, and his fleet of luxury cars left abandoned in locked garages. Properties registered in his name had been transferred months earlier to untraceable identities. Even his closest associates were stunned, realizing they had been working beside a man who never truly revealed his entire plan to anyone. Investigators were certain they finally had the proof needed to convict him. Offshore accounts were linked back to his operations, and forged contracts traced directly to his companies. But none of it mattered without Rizwan himself. What frustrated authorities most was the timing. It was as though he had anticipated every move and exited just moments before the walls closed in. Some believed he received a tip-off from a hidden source inside law enforcement. Others thought he had carefully monitored their progress all along, waiting for the perfect moment to vanish. Rumors spread quickly about his fate. Some claimed he had fled abroad, living in luxury under a new identity, with billions hidden in foreign banks. Others whispered that he never left the country, instead disguising himself as an ordinary man, blending into the very city where he once ruled the underworld. There were even stories that he staged his own death, allowing authorities to believe he was gone forever while he quietly rebuilt his empire from the shadows. None of these theories could be confirmed, but each added to his growing legend. For law enforcement, the case became a haunting reminder of how one man had turned crime into a profession so refined that even his downfall looked like another perfectly executed plan. For the public, his story remained a mixture of fear, fascination, and curiosity. Rizwan Malik had begun as a street thief and transformed himself into a ghostly figure whose name carried weight long after he vanished. His disappearance ensured that his legacy would never truly end. Whether alive or dead, free or hiding, Rizwan had succeeded in what he always desired: to remain untouchable. His story became less about his crimes and more about the mystery he left behind, a chilling proof that when crime becomes a profession, even justice struggles to keep pace.